Welcome. I'd really appreciate if you could drop a comment with your thoughts and reactions as you listen. Your feedback helps me craft better stories for you. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt, its rays reflecting harshly off the skeletal remains of abandoned skyscrapers. Tara wiped the sweat from her brow as she scanned the empty streets for any signs of movement. She gripped her rusted pipe tighter, ready to swing at the first shambling corpse that crossed her path. "Anything?" called Oliver from behind the rusted husk of a car. His eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. Sleep had evaded them both for too long in this desolate wasteland. "All clear so far," Tara replied. She gestured for him to follow as she picked her way through the rubble, ever watchful. They had to find supplies, and quickly before exhaustion claimed them as its next victims. After an hour of fruitless searching, their supplies dwindling down to a few moldy crackers, Tara spotted a towering structure in the distance. It rose above the crumbling skyline like a black obelisk, out of place among the ruins. "Let's check that building over there," she said, pointing. Oliver nodded hesitantly. He had a bad feeling about this place, but knew they had no other choice. As they drew nearer, a strange vibration seemed to emanate from the structure, setting their nerves on edge. The windows were dark hollows, revealing nothing within. When they reached the base, Tara gasped. She reached out to touch one, then jerked back with a cry. A flash of images assaulted her mind, her family decaying, jaws snapping as they shambled towards her, eyes pleading for mercy. "Tara, what's wrong?" Oliver grasped her arm, concern etched on his face. She struggled to speak through the panic. "I saw my family. They were infected. It showed me failing to save them." Her voice broke on a sob. That night had haunted her dreams ever since, and now the memory was as fresh and painful as before. Oliver turned to the monolith warily. "Don't touch it again. I think it can get inside our heads." As if in response, his vision swam and he stumbled, seeing not the ruins, but his own rotting corpse reaching for Tara with grasping fingers. He cried out, and the vision vanished, leaving him shaking. They stood in silence, catching their breath. This structure was no ordinary building. It possessed an unnatural power to conjure their deepest fears and regrets. But how? And to what end? As the sun sank below the skyline, casting the city in shadows, they knew they had no choice but to spend the night and unravel its mysteries, for their own safety and sanity. The setting sun cast long shadows across the monolith. As Tara and Oliver prepared their meager camp, neither spoke as they laid out their threadbare blankets, both lost in thoughts of the day's unsettling discoveries. As darkness fell, an eerie glow began to emanate from the monolith's carvings. Tara watched them warily from her bedroll, gripping her pipe. "Do you think it will show us more visions tonight?" Oliver nodded grimly. "We need to be prepared. Stay close and don't let it divide us. That seems to be its aim." No sooner had he spoken than the glow intensified, pulsing in an unnatural rhythm. Tara gasped as ghostly shapes began to coalesce before the monolith. Her family staggered towards her once more, skin sloughing off in gray ribbons. "No, not real. Just an illusion," she muttered, squeezing her eyes shut. But their moans and scraping footsteps were as clear as if they were truly present. She could smell the putrid stench of decay as rotting hands grasped for her. "Tara, don't listen," Oliver shouted, gripping her shoulders. "Look at me. We face this together." His voice cut through the nightmare, and slowly the visions faded. Tara collapsed against him, trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Oliver nodded, face pale, for he was now seeing his own visions, his body mangled and crawling with maggots, lunging at Tara with snapping jaws. He recoiled in horror, only Tara's touch keeping him grounded. The visions intensified as the night wore on, changing form to prey on their deepest insecurities. Tara saw Oliver torn apart before her eyes as she stood helpless. Oliver witnessed himself attacking Tara in a rage. Each time they pulled each other back, refusing to let the monolith drive a wedge between their fragile bond. By dawn, they were exhausted. As the visions faded with the coming of light, Tara noticed strange markings etched on the monolith's base. Look, some writing. Maybe a clue? Oliver peered closer. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet seemed almost scientific in nature. This doesn't look like the rest. Let me sketch it out. Once copied, they puzzled over the markings. These symbols, they remind me of something from before the outbreak. Some kind of research facility, I think, Tara said slowly. A memory stirred, of touring an abandoned lab as a child. Hieroglyph, like schematics on the walls, talking about what? Mind control experiments, Oliver said suddenly. That's what this is. It's testing our reactions, exposing our fears. A chill went through Tara at the implications. But to what end? And who created such a thing? They had uncovered more questions than answers, and the monolith's true purpose remained shrouded in mystery. But at least now they understood its nature, and could begin to fight back against its insidious invasion of their minds. The sun rose sluggishly over the ruins, its light doing little to lift the shadows from Tara and Oliver's eyes. They sat huddled together, analyzing Oliver's sketch of the strange symbols by the monolith's base. These markings, I'm sure I've seen them before, muttered Tara. That abandoned lab, I remember more now. They were studying how to manipulate thoughts and emotions. Oliver nodded grimly. For weapons, most likely. But against who? And why create something with this kind of power? A chill wind blew through the empty streets, carrying faint moans on the air. Tara stiffened. The dead. They're coming, drawn by the monolith's influence over our minds. Springing into action, they hurriedly gathered their meager supplies. We need to shut it down, and fast, said Oliver. Those clues you noticed. Try different combinations on the monolith. As Tara began inputting code sequences, the monolith pulsed angrily. Strange symbols flashed before their eyes at dizzying speed, revealing glimpses of the structure's true purpose. An experiment. To study the limits of the human psyche, gasped Tara. It was testing soldiers' resilience on the battlefield. Oliver cried out as the last piece fell into place. And when the outbreak began, they turned it on the infected, hoping to control the plague. But it had unintended effects on all minds. In the distance, an unearthly howl rose as the dead shambled ever closer. With a final code, the monolith went dark, but the visions did not fade. Instead, a horde of zombies materialized before them. Together, we can beat this, shouted Tara, swinging her pipe. Oliver unsheathed his knife and stood back to back with her, fighting off snapping jaws and grasping hands. Wave after wave attacked as the pair battled their inner demons made manifest. With each foe struck down, another memory surfaced, of friends and family lost, failures and regrets faced and overcome. At last, the final zombie fell, as its corpse dissolved into nothingness. So too did the last vestiges of the visions fade. Tara and Oliver stood alone in the ruins, exhausted but free. We did it, said Oliver softly. We faced our fears and learned the truth. Now the past no longer haunts us. Tara smiled, the first real smile Oliver had seen from her. A new dawn. Let's go find ourselves a future, shall we? Hand in hand, they walked into the rising sun, leaving the monolith and its shadows behind at last. The setting sun cast long shadows through the empty aisles as Maya and Carlos searched the supermarket for supplies. Most shelves had been picked clean long ago, but they still checked every nook and cranny, hoping for something useful. "Find anything?" Carlos called from across the store. His voice echoed in the cavernous space. "Just some expired canned goods," Maya replied, tossing a rusted can into her backpack. Every little bit helped. As she moved down the aisle, a glint caught her eye on a high shelf. Standing on her tiptoes, she pulled down a dusty bottle of water. Jackpot. A crash in the back of the store made them both jump. Maya drew her knife as Carlos readied his pistol. Slow, shuffling footsteps grew louder. They crept toward the sound, senses on high alert. 3 figures emerged from around a corner. Their skin hung in gray tatters, eyes milky white orbs. Zombies. The creatures moaned and staggered forward, drawn by the survivor's scent. "I've got this," Carlos said, taking aim. 2 precise shots dropped the first 2 zombies, but the third was faster than it looked, lurching at Maya with outstretched arms. She sidestepped its grasp and plunged her knife into its skull with a wet crunch. As it collapsed, the building shuddered. Cracks spider-webbed across the ceiling. "We need to leave. Now!" Maya yelled. They sprinted for the exit as the roof began to cave in. Chunks of concrete rained down around them. With a thunderous crash, the ceiling collapsed, blocking the front doors in a pile of rubble. They were trapped. There! Carlos pointed to a hole in the wall, just big enough to crawl through. They scrambled outside as the rest of the structure crumbled behind them. Catching their breath in the fading light, Maya turned to Carlos. "Thanks for the assist in there. You've got good aim for a soldier." He shrugged. "It's been a while. I was stationed overseas, not fighting the undead." "What made you want to enlist?" she asked, genuinely curious. Carlos was silent for a long moment. Maya nodded in understanding. They'd all had their reasons for the lives they left behind. "I was a nurse before," she offered. "Wanted to help people." "Let me guess. It wasn't so easy when the world ended." She shook her head. The memories still haunted her, of screaming patients dragging themselves down the halls, the sick and injured she couldn't save no matter how hard she tried. How many had died because she was one person against the apocalypse? Carlos must have seen the pain in her eyes. "You did your best," he said gently. "That's more than most." Maya gave him a small, grateful smile. She was starting to think teaming up wasn't such a bad idea after all. As night fell, they gathered their meager supplies and began the long walk back to their makeshift camp. But amidst the ruins, something caught their eye that made them freeze in their tracks. A swirling vortex of light had appeared in the distance, hovering above the city center. It pulsed and rippled like a wound in the fabric of reality. Mesmerized, Maya and Carlos could only stare in awe and dread at the mysterious phenomenon. Whatever it was, they felt instinctively it was not natural, and somehow they knew they had to investigate. The swirling lights of the vortex danced behind Maya's eyes as she tried to sleep. Each time she closed them, the visions returned, fragments of memories playing out in surreal ways. She saw herself back at the hospital on that first chaotic day, but the patients were already reanimated, lurching down the halls with outstretched arms. One grabbed a colleague and tore out her throat as Maya watched, helpless. Then she was a child again, huddled under the bed as her parents screamed downstairs. But their voices changed, taking on guttural, animalistic tones. She squeezed her eyes shut tighter, not wanting to see what happened next. A hand on her shoulder jolted Maya awake with a gasp. Carlos peered down in concern. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, still catching her breath. "Just dreams." He knew better than to pry. They'd all had their share of nightmares in this new world. The sky was just beginning to lighten as they packed up camp. Maya tried to shake off the lingering unease from her visions, but an undercurrent of dread remained. Something about that vortex was messing with their heads. They hiked through the ruins, keeping alert for any signs of the undead. The streets were eerily quiet. "Too quiet," Carlos muttered. Maya silently agreed. It wasn't normal for so few zombies to be around, especially near the city center. As they neared the vortex, an oppressive energy hung in the air, making the hairs on their arms stand up. The swirling lights had intensified overnight, pulsing with an ominous rhythm. Maya and Carlos exchanged a worried glance. Without warning, a piercing shriek split the silence. They whipped around to see a lone zombie staggering toward them, mouth gaping in a soundless wail. Carlos took aim, but before he could fire, 2 more emerged, then 5, then dozens, pouring around corners and crawling from alleyways. A massive horde was converging on their position, drawn by the vortex's power. "Shit," Carlos cursed. "Run." They sprinted down the street as the zombies shambled after them, moaning and grasping. An alley up ahead. If they could make it, they might lose the horde in the maze of side streets. Maya leapt over a fallen sign and pulled herself through a narrow gap in a fence. Carlos right behind. They pressed themselves against the grimy wall, hardly daring to breathe as the horde shuffled past. One zombie lingered, sniffing the air. Carlos raised his pistol, but Maya grabbed his arm. Not yet. They watched with bated breath as the zombie ambled away. As the last moans faded into the distance, they slumped in relief. "That was too close," Carlos panted. "No kidding," Maya replied shakily. They took a moment to catch their breath. The encounter had shaken them both. Carlos's hands were unsteady. Maya's mind still reeled from the surge of adrenaline and terror. They had to get off the streets, away from the vortex's influence. But where could they hide that the horde and whatever else was out there wouldn't find them? An abandoned apartment building loomed at the end of the alley. It would have to do. The lobby was strewn with debris. A rancid smell hung in the air. They climbed the creaking stairs carefully, weapons raised. On the 3rd floor, Maya tried a door, and it swung open with a rusty squeal. Empty, as far as they could tell. They barricaded the entrance and collapsed against the wall, exhausted physically and mentally from their ordeal. Maya closed her eyes, but immediately the visions returned. Her parents, the hospital, all twisted into nightmares. She opened them with a gasp. Carlos was watching her with concern. "You want to talk about it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then decided she had nothing left to lose. In halting words, she told him everything. Her life before, her failures at the hospital, the guilt that still weighed on her. To her surprise, Carlos opened up as well. He spoke of his abusive father, the escape he found in the army, and the horrors of war that still haunted him, the friends he couldn't save. By the end, they sat in silence, having bared parts of themselves to each other they'd never shared with anyone. A fragile understanding passed between them. They weren't sure how long they sat like that, lost in thought, when a low moan from outside jerked them back to reality. Carlos peered through a crack in the barricade and swore. The horde was returning, drawn to the building by their scent, and it was larger than before. "We have to get out of here," he said grimly. Maya nodded, already scanning for an escape route. There, a rickety fire escape clung to the outside of the building. It would be a precarious climb, but it was their only chance. She grabbed a crowbar and began prying open the window as Carlos kept watch. With a final screech, the window gave way. Maya hauled herself out onto the rusty grating and reached back to help Carlos. Below, the zombies were shuffling into the lobby. They had no time to lose. She started down the trembling escape as fast as she dared, Carlos close behind. But the metal groaned under their weight. With a lurch, one section collapsed, sending Maya tumbling. She managed to grab hold of the railing, but it bent alarmingly, ready to give. Carlos grabbed her wrist just as the railing snapped off the wall. For a terrifying moment, they dangled 3 stories above the horde. With a grunt, Carlos heaved Maya back onto solid footing. "Go, go!" They scrambled down the remaining levels as the escape shuddered and dropped away behind them. With a crash, it collapsed onto the mass of zombies below. Maya and Carlos didn't look back, sprinting through alleyways and side streets with no clear direction. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between them and that vortex. As they ran, the building seemed to warp and shift, corners bending at unnatural angles. Was it a trick of the mind from their ordeal? Maya couldn't be sure anymore. All she knew was they had to escape this city and that vortex before it consumed them both. Maya and Carlos stumbled through the ruins, exhausted and disoriented. The vortex's influence had warped the city into an endless maze, twisting reality around them. How long had they been wandering? Hours, days. Time had no meaning here. They leaned on each other to stay upright as the buildings loomed like monstrous shadows. A flash of movement. Maya whirled, knife raised, but it was only Carlos. His eyes were wild, face gaunt with fear and fatigue. She grasped his arm to steady him. "We'll get through this," she promised, as much for her own reassurance. Somewhere in the distance, a low moan echoed. The zombies were still out there, hunting them through this nightmare landscape. Maya tugged Carlos along, praying they could find a way out before the horde or their own unraveling minds claimed them. A familiar shape emerged from the fog. The vortex, pulsing with sinister light above a city square. They had circled back to where this nightmare began. No, a nightmare, a trap. The vortex saw them as prey, toying with their fears and memories until they lost all sense of self. It wanted to consume them, body and soul, until nothing remained. Well, Maya wasn't going down without a fight. She turned to Carlos, gripping his shoulders. "Look at me. We can beat this thing. We just have to face our demons." He nodded shakily. Together then. Carlos was back in the war, his unit overrun by insurgents. Bodies fell around him as he fired on empty. A comrade grabbed his leg in her death throes, eyes pleading. Maya stood helpless in the hospital, patients clawing at her as the infection spread. A familiar face leered at her, rotting flesh sloughing off bone. "No!" they shouted in unison, pulling each other back from the brink. These were not real. The past could not hurt them anymore. As one, they turned to the vortex. "You want our fears. Take them." They emptied their minds, offering up every trauma, every regret, every dark memory they still carried. The vortex pulsed hungrily, drinking it all in. But instead of breaking under the onslaught, Maya and Carlos only felt lighter. The burdens were lifted, leaving room for something new to grow in their place. Hope. Strength. Each other. The vortex writhed, realizing its prey had turned the tables. No longer sustenance, their resilience was poison to its influence. With an unearthly shriek, it collapsed in on itself, imploding out of existence. The fog lifted, revealing familiar streets once more. Maya smiled wearily at Carlos. "We did it." He smiled back, the haunted look finally leaving his eyes. In the distance, a church steeple rose above the ruins, a beacon of salvation. With purpose renewed, they began the long walk out of that cursed city, ready to face whatever came next as long as they faced it together. The future was theirs to shape. As they left the ghosts of the past behind, Maya took Carlos's hand. Whatever happened from here, they would not be broken. The world might end again and again, but their humanity would endure. This, she knew, was only the beginning. Breath ragged, I stagger back, feeling the splatter of blood. Not all of it mine, cooling on my face. The relentless groans of the undead echo in the makeshift arena, a chilling soundtrack to this grotesque dance of death. I can't afford to think. only react as another one lunges at me, its teeth bared in a ravenous snarl. But how did I get here? 2 years earlier. The flyer was almost laughable in its optimism, a safe haven in a world gone mad. It proclaimed in bold, hopeful letters. I remember scoffing at it, the idea that any place could promise safety in a world overrun by the undead. But desperation and loneliness have a way of gnawing at your skepticism. I tucked the flyer into my pocket, a tiny ember of hope in a world shrouded in despair. Back in the present, I dodge a swipe from a decaying hand, its fingernails caked with dried blood. The crowd's cheers are a distant roar, their faces a blur. Their faces a blur. They're here for the spectacle, the primal thrill of life and death played out before their eyes. But for me, it's survival, nothing more. The journey to the haven was a blur of exhaustion and fear. I had traveled for days, navigating through abandoned towns and overgrown roads. The world I once knew was now a graveyard of civilization, with remnants of the past haunting every corner. The haven was located in what used to be a small, secluded town, now fortified with barricades and watchtowers. As I approached the gates, my heart pounded not just from the journey, but from the uncertainty of what lay beyond. Would I find sanctuary or just another form of hell? Now, as I parry another attack, I can't help but laugh bitterly at my past naivety. The haven did offer sanctuary at first. A warm meal, a bed, the company of other survivors. It seemed like I had found a rare oasis. But the cost of this sanctuary was steep, far steeper than I could have ever imagined. As I plunge my makeshift weapon into the skull of another zombie, a part of me wonders if I was better off outside these walls. Here, I'm alive, but am I really living? Or am I just another pawn in a twisted game? A spectacle for those who have lost their humanity to the apocalypse? And as the sun sets on another day of survival, I know one thing for sure. This isn't the end of my story. It's just another fragment, a piece of a larger, more terrifying puzzle that I'm yet to fully comprehend. The arena is a cacophony of terror and excitement, a stark contrast to the deceptive calm of the haven when I first arrived. As another zombie lurches towards me, its grotesque form a twisted shadow of humanity, I'm forced to focus, pushing away the memories that threaten to overwhelm me. But memories, like the undead, have a way of creeping up on you. 3 months earlier, the haven was a revelation, nestled amidst the chaos of a world overrun by the undead. It stood as a beacon of hope. The tall, reinforced walls painted a picture of security. And the people. They were alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. Children played in makeshift playgrounds. Gardens flourished under careful tending, and communal meals were a time for laughter and sharing stories. Sarah, with her warm smile and eyes full of empathy, was the embodiment of the haven spirit. We're more than survivors here, she told me as we walked through the compound. We're a community, a family. We look out for each other. I found comfort in her words, in the normalcy that the haven seemed to offer. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild something resembling a life amidst the ruins. Now, in the arena, that hope feels like a cruel joke. Each thud of my weapon against the rotting flesh of the zombies is a grim reminder of the haven's betrayal. The faces of the spectators blur into a single entity, a monster feeding on the violence for entertainment. I see Sarah among them, her expression unreadable. Was she always part of this deception, or did this place corrupt her too? As the days passed at the haven, the cracks began to show. It started with small, unsettling occurrences. A shift in the way people spoke to me, a sense of unease that crept into conversations. The haven's leaders, once so welcoming, now wore masks of politeness that didn't quite reach their eyes. Then there were the missing people. One day, They were there, part of our family. And the next, they were gone without explanation. They found a better place. We were told, but the unspoken truth lingered in the air like a foul stench. I remember finding a hidden room one evening, behind a nondescript door in a less frequented part of the compound. Inside, the walls were lined with names, dates, and what appeared to be betting pools. It was a chilling revelation. The Haven wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a front for something far more sinister. The realization hits me as hard as the blows I land on my undead assailants. The Haven was never about saving us. It was about using us. We were not just survivors. We were pawns in a twisted game designed for the entertainment of those who had lost their humanity, long before the zombies ever appeared. As the final zombie falls at my feet, a hush descends on the crowd. I stand there, panting, my hands trembling with a mix of adrenaline and revulsion. I've survived another day, another fight, but at what cost? And as the gates of the arena slowly close, trapping me once again in this nightmare, I realize the fight for survival is far from over. It's a fight for my soul, for what's left of my humanity in a world where even the living can be more monstrous than the dead. The clash of metal against bone rings out, a harsh symphony that's become my life soundtrack. As I fend off another wave of the undead in the arena, my mind drifts unbidden to the days when the true nature of the Haven began to unravel. 2 months ago. It was a night like any other in the Haven when I stumbled upon the horrifying truth. Sneaking into a restricted area, lured by hushed voices, I found myself peering into a room filled with monitors. On those screens, I saw the arena, but not as I knew it. I saw bets being placed, people cheering, and then my own face, bloodied and determined, fighting for survival. The leaders, including Sarah, were there, discussing the performances with a cold clinical detachment. "It's fascinating," one of them remarked, "how quickly they adapt, how fiercely they fight when they think there's hope." I felt a chill run down my spine. The Haven wasn't a sanctuary. It was a laboratory, and we were the test subjects, observed and bet on for some sick form of entertainment and study. Back in the present, another zombie falls at my feet, and I can't help but wonder if there's a camera somewhere, capturing this moment, turning my fight for life into a spectacle. The realization fills me with a burning rage, but also a piercing clarity. I need to escape. I can't be their pawn any longer. The memory of that night haunts me. After my discovery, I couldn't look at the Haven the same way again. Every friendly smile seemed sinister. Every word of encouragement, a veiled threat. I began to plan my escape, but with every passing day, the weight of the truth bore down on me, threatening to crush my resolve. Now, as I stand in the arena, a decision looms before me. Do I continue to play their game, to fight for a survival that's nothing more than an illusion? Or do I use this fight as a means to an end, a way to turn the tables on those who've imprisoned us all in this twisted experiment? A zombie lunges at me, snapping me back to the present. I sidestep, using its momentum to drive my weapon through its skull. As it crumples to the ground, I realize that every move I make, every decision from here on out, isn't just about survival. It's about rebellion. It's about tearing down the facade of the Haven and exposing the truth. And as I brace myself for the next wave of the undead, I know what I must do. The fight isn't just in the arena. It's against the very people who turned our hope into horror. The truth has been unveiled. And now, it's time to act. The moment of my escape was both the most terrifying and exhilarating of my life. As the Haven's gates clanged shut behind me, I didn't look back. I ran, fueled by a mix of fear, anger, and a desperate hope for freedom. 2 days earlier, the plan was simple but risky. During the next fight, I would create a diversion, using the chaos to slip away. I had managed to steal a key from one of the guards. a small, cold piece of metal that represented my only chance at freedom. In the present, I'm miles away from the haven now, but the ghosts of that place still haunt me. I keep moving, never staying in one place for too long. The world outside the haven's walls is just as brutal, but at least it's real. At least my survival isn't entertainment for twisted spectators. The night of my escape plays over in my mind. The arena was a frenzy of noise and violence. In the midst of it all, I made my move. The guards were too distracted to notice me slipping away. I remember the pounding of my heart, the sheer terror that they would catch me before I could escape. But they didn't. I made it to the gates, unlocked them, and stepped into the night. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between me and the haven as possible. Now, as I navigate this new world, I'm faced with a harsh reality. The haven may have been a prison, but it was also a community. Out here, it's just me. The loneliness is overwhelming at times, but it's a small price to pay for freedom. Occasionally, I wonder about the others I left behind. Did they ever realize the truth about the haven? Did anyone else manage to escape? These questions linger in my mind, unanswered. And the biggest question of all, what now? The world is still a wasteland, overrun by zombies and devoid of the life we once knew. But there's a sense of purpose that drives me now. The haven taught me that even in the darkest of times, we have a choice. We can submit to the horror, or we can fight against it. I choose to fight. Not in an arena for the amusement of a corrupt few, but for myself, for my own survival. As I settle down for the night in an abandoned building, I realize that my story isn't over. It's just beginning. The road ahead is uncertain and fraught with danger, but it's mine to travel. And somewhere out there, in the vast, zombie-infested wilderness, there might just be another haven, a real one this time. But for now, I keep moving, surviving, living.